Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome to day number 5 of the Simon Says Stamp Card Kit for October 2018. Today I'm going to be making 2 cards and we're going to be making these at the same time. I'm starting off with 2 pieces of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. These are cut with the largest stitch rectangle die by Simon Says Stamp. And I'm going to be using my Misty here. Stamp positioner for this technique is pretty much a must. For my first panel, I'm going to be using a variety of colored inks, all by Simon Says Stamp. For the second panel, I'm going to be stamping with the intense black ink. So I'm starting with this one panel here, stamping my image, flipping my panel around, and stamping my image again. I'm not moving my stamp from my positioner. Then I'll move on to the next panel, switch over to the intense black ink, and stamp my image in the same exact spot on this panel as well. You can see sometimes my stamp was clean, but it was still a little damp, so I didn't get the best impression. But once I color it in, you're really not going to be able to tell the difference. Once I had my first image and my first color down, I'll move on to the next image, and this will be the other flower, other single flower that's in the set. And I'm going to be stamping this with the Hollyhock ink for my colored panel, and then move on to the intense black ink for my black and white panel. Again, just flipping my panel each time. It makes it easier. I only have to stamp this, or position it once rather, for both panels, and I'm getting 2 images on each panel. I did cut masks with full stick post-it notes for these images, just 2 of each. Right now, I'm trying to avoid any masking just because I only do have 2 of those masks, and I didn't want to have to move them around all that much. I'll continue to kind of move my images around here. Here's where I'm going to have to bring out my masks. Luckily, these are pretty easy images to fussy cut out, so it wasn't too big of a deal. Once I had my first 2 colors down, which would be the pink and that, like the aqua or pool color, I'll go back to that original image, that little squiggly flower, but this time I'm going to bring out the Wisteria ink. I think that's how you pronounce it. This is like a purplish color. And I'll be stamping this the same way, except for now, being I have my panel starting to fill up, I'm going to have to do a little bit more masking. So each time I'm just moving my masks a little bit, especially if your masks are hanging over the panel, you're going to want to remove them before you flip your panel. It will prevent your panel from sitting right there in the corner of your Misty or your stamp positioner, so it may not be exactly lined up like you want it to be if you don't remove those masks first. Again, stamping this twice on each panel, once with the colored ink, then going on to my black and white panel and stamping that down with my intense black ink in the same position, masking off the same images as I did with the first. Once I was happy with all of my flower placement, I'll move on to the little leaves that are part of the set. And again, I'm going to have to do a little bit of masking here, but I'm using Jelly Bean ink for my colored panel. And you can see all the way off to the right, I masked that flower and didn't need to. I'll realize that later. I'm stamping this with the Jelly Bean ink on the colored panel, and again with the intense black ink on my black and white panel, moving those masks around each and every time. You just want to make sure that your stamp is completely clean, especially if you're going from the black to whatever colored ink you're using. You're going to get a gray tone or some splotchiness if your stamp is not completely clean before you switch over to a different color. You can see not always is my stamp dry. It's clean, but it's not dry. But being we're going to be doing some Copic coloring, and this is actually kind of considered a no line coloring technique, you're really not going to be able to tell the difference too much. Once all my stamping was done, we'll move on to the coloring, and I'm not going to show you all of the coloring. I'm basically going to show you my color combinations. Starting off with these little purple flowers, I'm laying out my lightest color, which is the V01 onto my darkest areas, shading just on the inside of each one of these petals or folds. Moving on to my darkest color, this is the V17, going right over those lines. Now some of these areas are pretty tiny, so I'm just using the tip of my marker, barely touching the paper, especially on the inside of the flower. The middle petal is kind of large, so I'm not worried about having too much of a shadow or too much of a highlight there. Next, moving on to my darkest mid-tone, the V15, extending those lines out a little bit further, especially like I said, in that middle panel, I'll extend it out a little bit further than I normally would. Moving on to my lightest mid-tone, which is the V12, extending that out even further. The only petal that's going to have a real highlight is that center one. The rest of them are not really going to be too noticeable, being they're such tiny areas. But I'll go in with that V01 and fill in the entire flower, and I colored all of the purple ones the same exact way. For my little blue-green ones, I'm using my BG markers naturally, and again coloring this the same way, doing my shading the same exact way as I did with the purple one. I'm mainly just showing you this one to show you the color combinations. My darkest color is the BG18. I'll blend that out with the BG15, then the BG13, which is actually very similar to the BG13, and then finally back to the BG11, filling in that entire flower. Then we'll move on to the pink flowers, and I'll be using my RV markers here, and I'm coloring these the same way as I normally do, laying out my lightest color first where my darkest areas will be, which I'm just putting my shading right there in the middle of the flower where the petals are kind of branching out from the center. Moving on to my darkest color, just putting in a flick or two on each one of those petals because this is a super dark color. Moving on to my RV17, extending that darker color out just a little bit. Now you don't want to overblend with RV markers. They tend to pick up the color of the darker marker that you used before. So you don't want to overblend, just go over it quickly and leave it as is. Last, I'll go in with my lightest color again and fill in the rest of those petals. Now for the center of these flowers, it's got a center and like a little stem or stamen that goes over one of the petals. I kind of covered it up a little bit. It's hard to see, but I'm going to go in with one of my Y markers and just fill that in solid. I'm not doing any kind of shading for that. For my leaves, same technique here, laying out my lightest color, going in with my darkest color, and I ended up going over the entire stem too, just to kind of make it more cohesive, I guess. Then I'll go in with my mid-tone, which is the YG06, extend those flicks out a little bit further, and then finally back to my highlight color and then filling in the rest of those leaves, blending out that YG06. For my black and white panel, I did the same type of shading that I did for the entire other panel as far as where my shadows and where my highlights are, but I'm using my C markers here, my cool grays, and for these I'm going right in with my darkest color. Cool grays and warm grays, they blend very well together. I don't feel the need to waste my time and waste my ink by putting down my lightest color first. My darkest color is the C7, blending that out with the C5, blending that out even further with the C3, and then finally I will go in with the C1, filling in that entire flower. For the center of this flower, where we normally colored it yellow on the other panel, I'm just filling it in with my C1, again, not doing any kind of shading there. Once my panels were all colored, I am using another one of the Stitch Rectangle dies, and this is the third to largest. And I'm just centering this on my panel, sticking that down with some Post-it note tape and running that through my die cutting machine. For the next panel, I'm going to line up the, I guess you can call it a frame, on top, just so that I have my placement exactly the same when running this one through my die cutting machine. Now, you'll see when you lay the die over the opening that we'd already cut out, it kind of just fits into place like a puzzle piece, so you will have no problem lining this up at all. Running that through my die cutting machine again, and now we'll move on to the sentiments. You'll see that I'm going to mix and match these. So part of the panel is going to be black and white, part of it's going to be colored. You can see I have a little bit of a smudge there on the middle black and white panel. So I'm just going to take my sand eraser and try to take some of that up. It didn't completely take it up, but as I say, if there's a mistake, that's what sequins or Nuvo drops are for. I'm going to make one of my cards a landscape card, one a portrait card, stamping my sentiments with VersaFine Onyx Black ink right there in the center of my center panel. And I'm going to use my Tombow Mono multi-glue to adhere my little frames down to A2 size white note cards. One is going to be a top folding. Well, actually, they're both going to be top folding, but one's vertical, one's horizontal. And you want to make sure that if you're using liquid glue, you're also putting it there in the center so that the opening there of the frame is not, it won't come up from your card base. Once I had those adhered flat to my card bases, I will adhere my middle panels there, but I didn't want these to be flat. You certainly could, but I wanted to add a little bit of dimension and a little bit more interest to it to kind of separate the two. So I'm just going to be taking my Scotch foam tape here and just lining that up. It actually fits perfectly onto the back of these panels and popping them up right there in the center. Again, putting the black and white with the color to kind of mix and match these up a little bit. And last, once I had those adhered, I will add a few Nuvo drops, and these are the clear glitter drops. And I'm just going to add a few of those around the sentiment, mainly to cover up that little smudge that I wasn't able to take away with the sand eraser. And those are the 2 cards for today. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.